These are the trumpets. And these are the clarinets. So actually that the organist can never hear what the organ really sounds like, because the best acoustic spot is always in the audience. It's over there, like in the 2/3 of the church. Okay, let me think for a while. I'm not gonna answer.
Stanford University, 9,000 acres, 11,000 students. Built by Leland Stanford, railroad tycoon, gentleman farmer on his stud farm at Palo Alto. Memory of his son. The climate is mild. Midday temperatures range from 60 degrees in winter to 74 degrees in summer. Average precipitation 15.5 inches, 35 miles north of San Francisco on Freeway 101, 15 miles from Los Angeles, 400 and Northlight University.
Death is very central to Stanford University in a very visceral way. I think it's built into the landscape itself. So not just at the mausoleum, but outside the mausoleum, the very way that the landscape of Stanford is organized. Palm Drive, the symbolism of the palms themselves, palms stand for immortality. Palm Drive leading up to the oval forms the shape of an ankh, if you look at it from a bird's eye view. Also a symbol of immortality. So just being on this campus, you sense the death and the grief, really, of Leland and Jane over the death of their son all the time. The ideal liberal education it's about how to live a good life. And how to live a good life necessitates knowing how to deal with death, right? I think that life is full of pain. It's full of hardship, as the Stanfords well knew. And, how can we learn to make those hardships into something better, for the world that we're living in and for our own lives. Even if you're 18, 19, 20, you're not really thinking about death as imminent. We're all going to face it someday, right? And when we face it, how are we going to do so in a way that felt like we did something meaningful with our life? And I think the ideal liberal education gets us thinking about that sooner rather than later, right? It can never be too soon to think about that.
None of us would be here today at Stanford University were it not for the death of a child. The university is named in his memory, Leland Stanford Junior University. The funds for the university came from his father, Leland Sr., who had made his fortune in the railroad industry before becoming the 8th governor of California.
People thought the railroad company, and Leland Stanford included, were crazy to have the ambition of trying to get through the Sierra Nevada. But the Chinese workers made it happen. They finished 15 tunnels, including the Summit Tunnel, 1,800 feet long through solid granite, working through two terrible winters up in the Sierra. and got the Central Pacific Railroad through the Sierra and into Nevada and then ultimately over into Utah.
Leland Sr. saw this as his own crowning achievement, which he celebrated by hammering the last spike into the final rail tie at Promontory Summit, Utah in 1869.
Leland Stanford was a complicated historical person. He was virulently anti-Chinese, a xenophobe in his early political career. But after the construction of the railroad, which was dependent upon Chinese labor, he had a changed tune. And to his credit, he was able to recognize his mistake, and he acknowledged this later on in his life. As he got older, became more wise, now he was comfortable, and he became troubled with the continuing and actually escalating anti-Chinese sentiment in the United States and California in particular. And he came out to condemn the anti-Chinese sentiment and said this was wrong, that the virulent anti-Chinese elements targeted him and his cohort as enemies of the white working man. Chinese and the railroad barons were in cahoots against the everyday white working men. And they threatened to burn down their mansions on Nob Hill. They wanted to have violence against the Chinese and violence against the homes and the families and the persons that they identified as the dangers to the white working man.
But Stanford University would not exist had Leland Jr. not died of typhoid fever shortly before his 16th birthday while the family was traveling in Europe. So what does it mean to study at a university commemorating a dead child? It's easy to ignore this question. Leland's world is foreign and hard to fathom. He grew up in the lap of luxury and enjoyed a life of immense privilege. But it was also a life cut tragically short. And to remember Leland is to reflect on life itself. That is a large part of what going to college is about. As the Greek philosopher Epicurus taught,
living well and dying well are one and the same discipline.
The loss of a child by a parent is one of those profound griefs that is recognized and maybe makes us think of the institution in somewhat more human terms. Institutions can feel quite inhuman sometimes, and this one has such a human origin to it.
Leland's life wasn't only defined by his early death. By all accounts, he was a remarkable child. He loved to ride around the family's Palo Alto farm on his pony, chased by his dog Toots. He was an avid tinkerer. Once blowing up a boiler, he was connecting to a steam engine. His father insisted that he learn practical skills like accounting, but he also excelled in history, algebra, and languages, studying Latin, French, and German. Leland's true passions lay in art and collecting. He loved to paint and draw, and would sketch buildings and landscapes when he traveled. He was exceptionally skilled at wood carving, exhibiting pieces at the San Francisco Mechanics Fair. His passion for collecting began with his travels to Europe. He purchased mementos from the many sites he visited with his parents, a fragment from the Leaning Tower of Pisa, a charred book from the Castle of Kronberg in Germany, bullets from a Prussian siege of Paris. Small things by which to remember these places.
It's rumored that actually the Museum of Modern Art knew that Leland Stanford Jr., the 10-year-old, had collected pieces to a special pottery that they had the other halves to. And so they were sending this young kid in California the pieces to complete his art collection.
He was equally curious about natural history, collecting rocks, geodes, and fossils. He seemed fascinated by everything and everyone he met, displaying, as his tutor later wrote,
a general spirit of inquiry and interest.
Inspired by his visits to the Louvre, the British Museum, and the Vatican, Leland determined at age 13 that he too would one day found a museum for his collection. As his tutor remarked,
"What had been the pastime of an hour became the purpose of a life."
He started the museum on the 3rd floor of his San Francisco home and planned to gift his collection to the city one day. In the end, it became the seed of the Leland Stanford Junior Museum, today the Cantor Art Center.
I think why you're here at Stanford is to be a good collector, which is to feel that with everything that really matters to you, it emits from itself, each one of those things, a shine, a glimmer, a light that is aimed at you, as it were, and that beholds you and carries you and lifts you and shapes who you are. If you go through your Stanford time and don't let things shine on you, then so much the worse, I think. There's a kind of loss. It doesn't mean you don't glow from within still, but there's a way that collecting things, or I might say putting things in a kind of chapel for yourself, whether you're religious or not, putting those things in a chapel such that you can go to that place at any time, a hard time, for example, but also an ordinary and calm time, and behold these things that matter uniquely to you. That's something that no one can take away from you. The commercial culture can't take it away from you. The political culture can't take it away from you. It's inward, it's sacred, it's yours, but in a non-possessive way. I think it has a lot to do with grace and being on earth.
It's a very special place for me. I think it's kind of like a second home to me because I live in a double. Even though I don't identify with a single, a very specific religion, but I do think I like the whole atmosphere and the spiritual atmosphere here. I just never thought about death when I'm playing the organ. Yeah, even though this church is dedicated to memory, in memory of them.
Egli fu illustre matematico. Fisico e And finally, San Miniato is so important
For many undergraduates, there is a chance to study at one of Stanford's campuses abroad.
that during the famous siege of 1530,
Leland's most transformative experience was travel. He first visited Europe at 11 years old, touring England, France, Germany, and Italy. In his diary, he recounted a trip to the edge of the volcanic crater of Mount Vesuvius. He met Pope Leo XII and spent hours in artist studios in Paris. He returned home. His tutor recalled,
With a fund of gravity and thought capable of many things, he looked at things in a new light. His mind had developed wonderfully under the influence of all that he had seen abroad.
Stanford shares the feeling that the world is opening up, and that our country will need many people with a working knowledge of other languages, familiar with other cultures.
Before I came here, my best friend wrote a letter to me. She said, just remember that you're so much more than what Stanford is. She said, it's a two-way street, and they should know how lucky they are to have you as well.
Dr. Rhinelander, how much will Stanford do?
Well, I'm sure it will try to do everything it can. I'm also sure that no matter how much we succeed in doing, there will still be more improvement to be made. One of the things that I think is exciting about Stanford is the sense that improvement is needed, and we are anxiously seeking it. As to the central things you've been talking about, the problems directly of education, I would have to say simply that the job is principally yours, because while we can point you the way, we can't save you the journey.
As a student, Leland showed many of the qualities needed to pursue a meaningful education. To quote his tutor again,
he once said that the Rosetta Stone taught him his ancient history, for it first awakened his curiosity. And curiosity has this in common with our passions. Once awakened, nothing will satisfy it.
Leland never had the chance to go to college. We can only guess how his mind would have grown had he been granted a longer life. But it's clear from his brief studies that he found deep satisfaction and happiness in exploring his many interests. His collection was an outgrowth of his mind, which was a museum in itself, packed with memories of monuments, artists, and machines. And as the former president of Barnard College, Judith Shapiro, once observed, that is the true goal of college, to make your mind an interesting place to spend the rest of your life.
It is indeed true that a university cannot save its students the journey, but it can and does help to point the way.
The year after his death, Leland's parents drew up the founding grant of the university that would bear his name.
Growing up on campus as I did, my father was on the Stanford faculty. He would always say, when you go to Europe, the great families amassed wealth and they built castles in their honor. And you come to the United States and a great family amassed wealth and built a great university.
Their description of the university to be reads very much like an account of Leland's own interests. It includes
mechanical institutes, museums, galleries of art, laboratories, and conservatories, together with all things necessary for the study of agriculture and for mechanical training, and the studies and exercises directed to the cultivation and enlargement of the mind.
The Stanfords hoped that Leland's love of learning and wide-ranging curiosity would live on in other children.
And you're taking Chinese. Do you like it?
Very much, yes. As I go along, I like it more and more.
And so the discussion, for example, about how it should be open to all of the children of California who are children of talent is something that would have been unknown to universities founded 50 or 100 years before.
The new university would be practical too, as Leland Sr. had wanted his own son's education to be. Its object, stated the founding grant, was
to qualify its students for personal success and direct usefulness in life.
What I want to do now is to learn Chinese, and to learn it so well that I can use it as I use English in whatever field I choose to go into. Now, I know this sounds sort of idealistic about the world and everything, but I do feel that if I combine Chinese with, say, economics or some other field, I will be preparing myself properly.
Stanford Sr. wanted to create an institution for people like himself who had come from sort of modest backgrounds, who could use education to lift himself up and to make something of himself in the world. So for him, learning was supposed to be useful. Leland Stanford knew that he didn't want individuals to sit up in a university and learn without applying that learning to solve big problems in the world, right? He knew that he wanted the institution to serve more than just the sons of the elites.
Alongside this practical object, the grant also included a list of the university's purposes.
To promote the public welfare by exercising an influence in behalf of humanity and civilization, teaching the blessings of liberty regulated by law and inculcating love and reverence for the great principles of government, as derived from the inalienable rights of man to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
If this language sounds familiar, that's because it echoes the two most famous documents in United States history, the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution.
When I think about the purpose of an education, I think about this wonderful quote by W.E.B. Du Bois, where he says that education must not simply teach work, but it must also teach life. And I think that that quote speaks to us about what it means to be an educated person. It's not just in a vocational sense, but also in a sense of our shared life together. And if we're thinking about education and teaching life, we have to consider what it means to live in a society with other people and learn how to get along and learn how to work together, share resources, learn how to learn from one another. And I think that's what education truly means. It's not just about getting a job, but learning how to be more human and more humane to one another.
I think once you get out of college, and even in college, people get into the trap of being, what I say, too practical. I am running a company, I'm doing a lot of stuff outside of school, and obviously a lot of the times, when I have a problem set I don't want to do or whatever I don't want to attend to, I ask myself this question, like, why college? I'm doing math, but what I'm working in has nothing to do with it. I'll never solve a differential equation for work, and I'm totally fine with that. I enjoy math for what it is, and I think it's made me a better thinker, a better problem solver in most areas of life. And it's, I think, beautiful to look into the intricacies of math and, that world in general.
As the age of universities is measured, Stanford is young. Its founders established it to become a university of high degree. They perceived that to achieve this status, Stanford University must apply and be guided by the principle of free inquiry. This principle, like those civil liberties set forth in our Bill of Rights, was not easily won, and we would do well to remind ourselves of that fact. The reminder makes clear that Stanford, though young, is part of a centuries-old and priceless tradition.
To search for truth and teach the truth, to re-examine in the light of new knowledge.
Some of the biggest problems of citizenship have been evident throughout Stanford's own history. Who should be included as a citizen or a student, and who should not? The founding president of Stanford, David Starr Jordan, was an important ichthyologist, a scientist who studied fish. A follower of Louise Agassiz, an early adopter of Darwinism, Jordan turned the tenets of evolution upside down. Rather than focusing on the survival of the fittest, he fretted about the survival of the unfit. He became a leading eugenicist, lobbying for laws that legalized the forced sterilization of unfit persons. In 2020, Stanford decided
to remove David Starr Jordan's name from the campus spaces and to take steps to make his multifaceted history as Stanford's first president better known and understood.
So the investigation actually into David Starr Jordan's eugenicist belief was a movement that was begun by students who were doing archival work in the history department and uncovered some of these speeches and lectures that Jordan had given, and they started a kind of movement and encouraged professors to look into this. And so, I think that's a great example of the way in which the telling of the stories about our institutions is an ongoing project, it's a collaborative project, and it's one that necessarily involves students and faculty as well as community members.
Stanford was a co-ed institution from its foundation, so female students were always present, but they were not always treated equally. Jane Stanford herself didn't want too many women attending the university and capped their number.
I think we at Stanford frequently feel like imposters. We feel like we don't belong here. And I think it's because the past told us that we don't belong here. So I wish we felt like we belonged here, and I think apologizing and doing some small things would go a long way to make us all feel like not imposters.
Stanford was never segregated either, and the inaugural class included a black student, Ernest Houston Johnson, who died of tuberculosis 3 years after graduating. But black students did face discrimination over the following decades. A black student paper in the 1960s even decried the university as white Stanford. The administration responded to these criticisms by creating a program in African and Afro-American studies in 1968, and Ujamaa, an African-American themed dorm, in 1970. In 2021, the program in AAAS became a department. Students of Chinese and Japanese descent have also attended Stanford since its early days. Walter Fong, the first Chinese student to attend Stanford, graduated in 1896. But the largest Asian presence on campus was initially found among the Stanford staff. The Stanfords employed many Chinese servants, and Chinese laborers helped design the university gardens.
One of the astounding discoveries made by our colleagues is that the Chinese populated the ranks of the gardeners, of the farm, and of the early university, and they were responsible for constructing the ovals in the inner quad, some of the gardens over near the art museum, but most astoundingly, they planted the trees along Palm Drive. So the palm trees were planted by Chinese gardeners.
Stanford has always had intrinsic ties to Native Americans, as the university sits on the ancestral lands of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. The first indigenous student to attend Stanford, John Milton Oskison, graduated in 1898. But Native students also faced discrimination. In the 1960s, the newly formed Stanford American Indian Organization, of which Dean Chavers was a mainstay, convinced the university to abandon its racist mascot, the Stanford Indian. Since then, the university teams have competed as the Cardinal.
So part of being educated is actually looking critically at the assumptions you've inherited and what's been bequeathed to you, and asking yourself, like, do I accept this? Do I want to go along with this? And that's something everybody has to do. That's part of what it is to actually grow up, is to reflect on what you've been given and what you've been handed, maybe by your family, by your friends, and then think, well, what do I actually make of this? What do I want to make of it?
The 1960s and 70s also saw students of Latin American descent struggle for more visibility on campus and also engage in civic action. The Stanford Grape Boycott Committee collaborated with Cesar Chavez to increase wages for farm workers and migrant laborers. In 1972, Casa Zapata was established, a 4-class house focusing on the Latinx experience. 6 years later, El Centro Chicano y Latino was founded.
So learning that you can look critically at your own institution, but still be passionately loyal to the institution, still have great hopes for the institution, is something important to model for students as they get out into the world, because the fact that we can look at ourselves in a critical way, but not be either paralyzed by that or feel compelled to throw everything overboard, is a very powerful, useful message for people to take when they move out into society more generally.
Of course, we've been working for Goldwater for 4 to 6 years. We will continue to work. This will hurt us to some extent, perhaps, but this is the first time we've ever had our own candidate anyway, and so I don't think it's going to be that big a setback. Frankly, I think we're going to be stronger in the next 4 to 6 years, regardless of who wins the election.
The 1960s were a particularly divisive time on campus, as well as across the country as a whole. Students protesting the Vietnam War staged demonstrations and occupied buildings. Tensions boiled over when protesters burned down Stanford's Naval Reserve Officer Training Corps, or ROTC, building. Other students supported the war, staging counter-protests and stigmatizing the protesters.
Stanford seems almost pastoral compared with neighboring Berkeley, but conflicts are springing up these days in the most sedate American colleges. We have our liberal activists and a conservative opposition. The activists usually despise politics, yet they quickly got into the fray last election when Goldwater looked like a real threat.
You're not going to give me any time? All right. Fine. Before you stop and speak. Well, it'll be about that close.
When we think of the world, it's often with an eye to the present or the future. But many worlds also lie in the past, and these are no less relevant to us. As the Roman statesman and philosopher Cicero claimed,
"To be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to always remain a child. For what is the worth of human life, unless it is woven into the lives of our ancestors by the records of history?"
I think a lot of people live here like they have their entire lives here, and I think it's a mistake, because we're only here for a little bit. And we have to really, like my entire freshman year, I've noticed a lot of my friends didn't really take as much time to think about what they want to do with their lives. And they're just like doing one thing after another. And I think it's a mistake to not realize that we're here only for a little bit. I think a version of myself, I'd say, died when I got here. Like a high school version, like a younger version. And then I had to take the time to allow this new version to be born. And I think people don't give themselves that grace. People don't give themselves the grace of being in a new place and trying to be a new person and trying to grow as a person. And it's true, like we're all here because unfortunately a child died, and their parents decided to dedicate this school to him. And I guess that's the way we should live, and always remember that we're all gonna die one day, and that we shouldn't live a life based on what we are expected to do or what other people think. I think we should live a life that's authentic to us and sort of what we wanna do and how we wanna see the world.
Yes, one would think that the way to be a student is to be in the now with a capital N, to be in Silicon Valley, what's happening not yesterday but tomorrow, the next new thing, as it's said. And it can be the epitome of a kind of inconsequentiality, let's say, to be someone preoccupied with the past, let alone the past that seems to be dead and gone and no longer relevant in any obvious way, or the stuff of merely a statistical or kind of trivial interest. To all that I say bullshit. Like I say that is not what this is about, and that to have a connection to the past is a deep part of living in the present. It simply is part of the emotional liquidity of walking the earth for a short time.
the world is full of problems, but we also need to build, design, and live in meaningful ways. College is the time to lay a foundation for your whole future. You don't need to have it all planned out. The best preparation comes from embracing your curiosity and considering what gives you purpose.
My appointment is split between geophysics and electrical engineering. I study ice sheets, Antarctica, Greenland, and the icy moons of Jupiter. My scientists answer questions about how the ice sheets and the moons work themselves. My engineers build and invent radar systems to measure the ice sheets and the moons. At Stanford, what's amazing is it is such a technology-enthused place where my students and myself, as a person who creates instruments to observe the natural world, the fact that I make those tools are an asset. I'm celebrated as more of a scientist because I build things, not less. There are other places where the discovery itself is the primary thing, and the people who make the tools are helpers, but are not celebrated as richer and more multifaceted discoverers because of their technological capacity.
Not everyone has the chance to go to college. For those who do, it is the most amazing gift that you can offer your mind. Remember, Seneca once told a young student, only the soul is worthy of admiration.
So even though the organist is playing the organ of the church, but we will never show our faces towards the audience. We're always like facing backwards to the church. But I really feel like it's kind of like an analogy of that Leland Stanford has never seen the church that is named after him.
Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose. You are already naked. There is no reason not to follow your heart.